a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for January 20th, 2025, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody. On this episode, we ask the question, are we better men for watching this film?
I thought you were going to say, which one of us is the better man?
That could possibly be the question as well. And given the response to this film online and how I perceive this conversation going, I think that question will become quite clear to a lot of listeners. So
Okay.
we'll see how it goes.
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. But I am looking forward to getting into this because Better Man is certainly one of the more unique and interesting films that we've seen over the last perhaps 2 decades as far as music biopics go. I mean, we're all familiar with what the gimmick is here, right?
Yeah,
so,
that makes it seem maybe a little bit more interesting than perhaps it is. I'm sure we'll talk about it in that way.
And that's a conversation we are absolutely going to have. No doubt about that. But at the very least, you can't deny that it is attempting something.
It's
Whether
attempting
it
something.
works or not, it is doing something different. And we'll talk about it. But Better Man, that is the film that we are here to talk about. And it's interesting because there's been a lot of conversation. I don't know how many of our listeners are overseas. Maybe a few of you are. I don't know.
Yeah, this is a great point.
But here in the United States, Robbie Williams wasn't the star or the household name that he is over in the UK.
Right.
And like many ignorant Americans, Robbie Williams, I wasn't too familiar with his story or much of his music, to be honest. I mean, I was never into pop music all that much to begin with.
Sure.
Growing up in the 90s, you're, of course, smothered in the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and Britney Spears and all that sort of stuff. I mean, you cannot escape certain artists.
Yeah, which leads to the burning question, JD. For you, NSYNC or Backstreet Boys?
You know, I know that this is a hot button question here, and maybe this will determine if I'm the better man or not. I don't know, and I hate to have a cop-out answer here, so maybe I should just pick one and stick to my convictions. I don't know.
No,
but
just stick to your convictions.
The true
What's your honest answer?
Is I don't really have an opinion because I didn't really listen to either one.
I think you're at a certain age where you're kind of a little bit past the craze, right? At least at the time.
Perhaps. I mean, I think a lot of my peers were into those groups when they were in their heyday. It might have been perhaps my sister's generation a little, because she's a little bit younger than me, but I mean, not by much. Yeah. I mean, I feel like my peers, my class, if you will, listened to a lot of that style of music. It just wasn't my thing. That's just not something that I listened to all that much.
Sure.
So I don't really have a strong opinion.
Well, because how old were you when both of those groups really started to surface and become, in the cultural zeitgeist? You were probably 11, 12 years old by that point?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, I was like a prime age for it.
I don't know. I at least I think of it from my perspective, and of course, we're talking about this as straight men here. We're maybe not the target audience for those groups in the first place.
That could be part of it as well.
Yeah. But by the time that I was maybe 11 or 12 years old, I had gotten away from that type of pop music. But NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, Britney Spears really started to surface when I was at the right age. So I did listen to a lot of that stuff.
Gotcha.
But it wasn't until 12 years old where I started to venture into classic rock and different ventures of music. Perhaps you were just a little bit past the point of targetability in a way.
Yeah, I mean, at that age, I was way more into hip hop than I was
Makes
anything
sense.
else, and alternative rock was something that I was into at that age. I didn't really listen to pop music at all.
Mm,
I didn't really listen to mainstream radio all that much either. Um, I feel like I got a little bit more into that when I was in high schools, but certainly not
sure.
that age. And when those you know individuals bands were in their heyday.
Hmm.
But that is to say, at least here in the United States, they were inescapable still,
Oh, yeah, they
regardless
were all
of
over the
what you
place.
were into.
And it
You
wasn't just
knew.
them. It was a machine. It was a
Oh, it
machine
was
that the
yeah.
studios were churning out. It wasn't just the two of them. If we're going to talk about
Mhm.
boy bands specifically, it was 98 Degrees. It was New
98
Kids on the
Degrees as
Block even
well.
way before that. You want to
Yeah,
take it
exactly.
back to England, there was a group called Five that people liked. So there was a huge influx of them that it basically became this assembly line that
Yeah.
eventually killed itself is basically what ended up happening.
For sure, for sure. And because there was so much of an influx of it, especially American groups, and that's what we were exposed to mostly, though Robbie Williams of the world didn't really infiltrate the
Yeah,
American zeitgeist.
that was a very
So,
long-winded way of saying we haven't really listened to Robbie Williams growing up.
exactly. I don't know much about his story. I don't know much about his music. This was, in a lot of ways, my first exposure to it. And that did offer some intrigue for me to learn
Yeah.
more about him and his story. So
Did you
you
know any
couple
of his
that
songs?
with the gimmick here,
Yeah.
and I was curious, very
Yeah.
curious.
Did you know any of his songs
Nope,
before going into? Okay,
nope,
you didn't know
none of
anything.
them,
All right.
none of them. Nope. So I mean, again, I didn't listen to pop music
Yeah.
generally, let alone from overseas.
Yeah.
you
I
know?
I knew two of his songs before going into this, and that was it.
No.
Those songs were "Let Me Entertain You," which we'll talk
Okay.
about as it relates to this movie, I'm sure. And his other song was called "Millennium," which isn't even featured in this movie, which I thought was an interesting
Gotcha.
choice. But
Well,
those are
and
the
that's
only two I
another
knew.
thing too, because as I was watching the movie, I did not recognize any of the songs.
Mm.
But to your point, I do wonder if there are some other songs out there that I would recognize if I simply heard them. Maybe there are a few that I just don't know
It's
that it was Robbie Williams.
It's an
That's
interesting point.
possible.
It's an interesting point because I did watch this movie with my wife, and she also really liked it. But then I started, well, before we ended up watching, I started showing her some of Robbie Williams's songs just to see if she's heard of any of them. She's like, "Nope, don't know this. Nope, don't know this." I got to the song "Millennium." She's like, "I know this. I absolutely know this." So
Yeah, maybe that's the one I know. Yeah,
it's
I don't
interesting
know.
that if that's the one that really crossed over overseas and it's not in this movie, really goes to show that they were going for a real British sensibility for this one.
Yeah, and maybe that's what they were doing for sure.
Yeah.
Real quick, also before we get into it, let's briefly talk about Michael Gracey, whose only other feature directorial debut was The Greatest Showman. I think he did a
Mhm.
documentary around Pink, but as far as
Yeah.
feature dramas go, The Greatest Showman is what he is most known for in our world. What did you have a strong opinion one way or another about The Greatest Showman? Like, what did you think about that one?
No strong opinion. I think it's merely
Okay.
fine, honestly.
Yeah. Okay.
I sympathize with those that have a strong hatred for it, and I also sympathize with those that have a strong love for it. I can actually see both ends of that spectrum because I do think there are good things and terrible things in it. Most of the
Mhm.
terrible things in it, I think, are mostly due to the story, the subject matter, maybe some of the performances. But I think where the film is at its strongest really does come down to some of the directorial choices and some of those musical flourishes. I think
Yeah.
visually, I think even the songwriting itself, I think is actually okay. I think the way it functions as a musical, I think is probably its best attribute. I just don't really love the story supporting it the whole way through. That's
Yeah.
really my biggest issue with it.
Yeah. That's pretty much how I feel as well. I do think the music is catchy.
Yeah.
I do really like the music on its own terms. There are some sequences that are really well shot and well choreographed,
Hmm.
but I do agree with you. Outside of the musicality, the storytelling just isn't there for me.
Yeah.
I'm quite mixed on that film. Right down the middle. I know that's
Yeah.
not allowed in today's extremism and You know, we have to be polarized all the time.
This is just one of those movies I don't have the energy to partake in that conversation. The movie is just so merely fine for me, mathematically speaking.
And I agree. I mean, all kidding aside, when I look at that film analytically, emotionally, I'm right down the middle on it. I think there are some really good things about it, to your point, and there are elements of it, particularly the storytelling, that I think is not great, just really not good.
I'm with you, man.
I was pretty mixed on The Greatest Showman, but that did not stifle my curiosity for Better Man for the reasons I mentioned earlier. I did go into this very much with an open mind.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into Better Man. It is, of course, directed by one Michael Gracey. It stars Robbie Williams, Jono Davies, Steve Pemberton, Damon Harriman, Allison Steadman, and a bunch of others that come and go throughout the film. I don't know if there's anyone in particular that I missed. I mean, there's a lot of others that come and go. We have the characters of Take That and all the supporting characters around the narrative of Robbie Williams. And it's worth perhaps bringing some clarity to the fact that Robbie Williams is the narrator here and voices his own narrative. But Jono Davies is the one on set giving the performance of Robbie Williams, doing the motion capture and the voice. So just wanted to bring some clarity there. All right. If you're not familiar with Better Man, it is about the meteoric rise, dramatic fall, and remarkable resurgence of the British pop superstar, excuse me.
Yeah. It's not just
Robbie
star,
Williams.
it's superstar. And you know,
Superstar.
Robbie Williams wrote that synopsis himself.
Of course
he wants
did.
to emphasize on superstar.
Exactly. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into this. Brendan, what did you think about Better Man?
Oh, it's a lot better than The Greatest Showman, I'll tell you that. It's interesting, the narrative around this one. A lot of people really jumping at this film's defense, and a lot of it is because it's tanking at the box office here in the States. It's not doing well, but can you really blame the American audience for the reasons that we talked about up front? This is not really targeted for us. Most people don't even really know who Robbie Williams is. I would love to hear how this movie is doing in the European market specifically. I don't know what those numbers are offhand, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's better because I feel like the knowledge of Robbie Williams and the fandom of Robbie Williams is there. And I think what's interesting about this movie is for a lot of, it's interesting in similar ways to what we talked about with a movie like A Complete Unknown, also from 2024, the Bob Dylan biopic from James Mangold. That's a movie that very knowingly and kind of abrasively sticks to this music biopic Wikipedia style formula. And I don't love that movie, but I kind of respect it for really embracing that in a way. Better Man kind of does the same thing with a very centralized gimmick that obviously everyone knows about already. And that's how Robbie Williams is portrayed as a chimpanzee, right? That is the central thing here. And what's interesting about the movie and what I was so worried about going in was this movie going to be merely just that single gimmick trying to mask the fact that it has nothing new to offer? I kind of forgot about the gimmick 5 to 10 minutes in. I don't know about you, which I think is a testament to the movie working and actually serving a purpose in an interesting way. It has no interest in reinventing the wheel, but I do think it's doing some really interesting things emotionally to set itself apart from other movies of its kind outside of just its monkey-related gimmick. I think, if anything, what is really working for me about this movie is Robbie Williams himself having a place within it. Seeing an artist display this much vulnerability for himself while also not playing himself, but being involved in that process in a way, I actually really appreciated that level of vulnerability and openness. And I think that does give Better Man a bit of an edge and a bit of a leg up when compared to some of its other contemporaries that are doing very similar things, but not nearly as well. And I think that emotional core does give the movie something that is worth acknowledging. So I do really quite like this one. And it does make me wonder, between this and Rocket Man, the Elton John musical biopic, I'm looking forward to the next British music biopic musical with man in the title. I don't know what could be next, but I'm curious to see what that is.
Quickly, before I get into my thoughts, to speak to the European box office. I did pull up the numbers. Let me reiterate for context. The budget to this film was $110 million.
Yeah, it's not low.
Okay. Now, here in the United States, to your point, it has not resonated at all. Currently, the domestic box office is at $1.8 million.
Gosh.
That's bad.
That's really bad.
Really bad.
I think it had like a 70-some% drop off as well in its second weekend here in the States.
Not good. Not good.
Yeah.
As for the United Kingdom, a total gross of $6.1 million.
Okay, it's still not great.
Not great. Germany offers another 1.5, and then the Italy, Netherlands, and Spain combined offer around another 1.5. So
that's unfortunate.
Not good. Total worldwide, as of right now, it is $14 million. Again, the budget was 110.
That is really unfortunate. Perhaps this is a movie that was just very badly advertised. I think that could be part of it. It's hard to sell a gimmick like this for sure. And it's a shame where I think, and many people seem to agree with this sentiment, I'm not sure if you do, but I think Better Man is the better musical of 2024. And it's also the better music biopic of 2024 when compared to the likes of Wicked and A Complete Unknown specifically. I think it's better than both of those films.
Well, I'll use that as a transition into my opening thoughts. Because
Okay.
I think Better Man is one of the weirdest movies I've seen in a long, long time. And not because it substitutes Robbie Williams with a CGI chimpanzee that no one acknowledges in any way whatsoever.
Yeah.
The symbolism behind the idea is affable.
Sure.
It makes a lot of sense within the context of the film. And look, it's not every day that you see a chimpanzee snorting cocaine and having sex with groupies. That is a refreshing change of pace. No doubt about it. It's weird because there is a massive chasm between the gimmick and the material around it. I do not think the gimmick amplifies this story as much as it completely saves it. If you remove the CGI chimpanzee of it all, this film is everything that is deeply frustrating about the music biopic genre. Its generic rise to fall to redemption narrative is unbearably dull. Or should I say unapably dull? Maybe that's more appropriate there.
Okay.
I don't know. Sorry. I know. You know what? I don't apologize.
Don't apologize for that one. Don't apologize for that one. You have to own that one.
I'm going to own it. I'm going to completely own it. Unapably dull.
Wow. Good
Look,
job, I guess.
Thanks. When the film isn't acting as a musical, I was bored to tears. It is charming. I think the performances are engaging. It's just so trite and mundane in how it's structured as a story. Yet despite how uninspired the script is, the gimmick of turning Robbie into a chimpanzee truly is fascinating. The musical numbers are electric. There's an entrancing visual language here that is nothing short of remarkable. The editing is often inspired and clever. The choreography is stunning. The cinematography is redolent. It is crazy how in one moment I'm on the verge of falling asleep to being completely immersed and hypnotized in the next moment. The swings of this film are unlike anything I've experienced in the last 10 years. I get why everyone is going crazy over something like the rock DJ sequence, for example, and that is electrifying for sure. I think for me, it was the massive concert sequence at the end where it literally turns into War for the Planet of the Apes.
Yeah, and that's the utilization of the song "Let Me Entertain You," which I think is the best song in this movie.
It is incredible. It is so extravagant. I love the camera work there. Again, the editing, the use of this gimmick, the rendering of the chimpanzees, which I think is worth noting, and forgive me if you already did and I completely missed it there. The visual effects here are done by Weta, who famously did the
yeah.
Planet of the Apes movies, the new
Yeah,
trilogy.
I did not
So
say that. So good call out there.
if the chimpanzee in Better Man, if it looks familiar, you're on the right track there. It is
Well,
the exact same team
Caesar defeated Koba through song.
Yes, it is the same renderings there. And I do think a lot of that is incredible. There's no denying the film's diverting qualities. I just wish the narrative supported the musicality. I wish it was just as invigorating, but sadly for me, it was far from it. Far from it.
Okay.
A lot of what happens in between the music is derivative and flatly boring. It's
Well-
everything that we've seen in this genre before a million times before.
Yeah.
But when the music kicks in, you've never seen anything like this before. Again, a dichotomy that I don't know if I've ever experienced in a movie like this.
Well, honestly, the last time I experienced something like that was Rocket Man, the Elton John biopic. And full disclosure, I'm sure you disagree with this. I like Better Man a lot more than Rocket Man. I think the biggest disparity between the two for me and what ultimately saves Better Man, it comes down to one thing, and it really has, not even really, it has nothing to do with its central chimpanzee related gimmick, because I don't disagree with you. I do think there is an ebb and flow to Better Man where it certainly peaks in the musical sequences, and it does tend to drop off a bit when it then starts to become a movie, or at least a more traditional movie by comparison. But the thing that really saves it for me, it's actually Robbie Williams himself. It's the voiceover narration. That's the thing that really saves it in a lot of ways. And I'm someone that usually doesn't defend voiceover narration as often.
That is surprising to hear, yeah.
Well, and I think because he gives it such a knowingness, such a self-awareness of his own absurdities, of his own celebratory but also vulnerable conditions when dealing with this story. A lot of people have made comparisons to not just movies like Rocket Man, but to varying other musicals for sure. The movie I was actually most reminded of, especially given some of the arduousness that's depicted here, whether it be related to drugs and sex, I was reminded a lot more of The Wolf of Wall Street, just given the knowingness that its subject matter has for the material. And I don't mean DiCaprio's narration in that movie. I mean Jordan Belfort's own sort of like the fact that he still seems to be celebrating his own life and has his own cameo in that movie as well. Like there is this like meta quality to Better Man, which is what ultimately saves some of those other sequences for me. I don't necessarily disagree with you that it does ebb and flow. When it does fall back to being just a movie, there are things that are very frustrating that it still keeps on doing the thing that music biopics tend to always do. But without Robbie Williams' voiceover narration, I would have been very much in your camp. He does a lot to save it for me, given his energy and his self-awareness. That's really the thing that separates it for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I do think he brings an ebullient energy to this film that does inject a level of charm that's undeniable. And he really is fun to listen to, but a lot of the time when that voiceover is injected into the film, it's in some sort of transition. And as much as I appreciate the voiceover narration, I don't necessarily disagree with anything that you're saying there. Once we land to the biopic narrative, that the film just does nothing to compel me. Absolutely nothing.
Okay.
It leans into tropes. It leans into stereotype. And the only thing that is different about it is, again, the gimmick. It is Robbie Williams transformed into a chimpanzee, and the characters never recognize it. And perhaps initially there is a little bit of a charm to that, but initially, or it doesn't take long for that to fade away, and all you see are the tropes and the stereotypes and the derivative nature of the film.
Which is what makes the chimpanzee gimmick really interesting, because on one hand, it's a very fascinating thing to have here, but the fact that you forget about it so quickly, is that a praise or is that a problem in not being able to continuously amplify some of these other things and some of these other tropes that it's living within, right? So it's an interesting question, because the monkey gimmick here, it has a symbolic purpose, but it's also very on the nose. You can kind of determine what its
Very.
purpose really. I mean, even the trailer has essentially given away what its symbolic purpose is. Robbie
Yeah.
Williams himself says, "I feel unevolved." Right? That's
Mhm.
very much what the symbolic purpose is. So when you forget about that, if you don't have anything else to grab a hold of you, then of course the movie's going to really ebb and
Mhm.
flow even worse than perhaps it should. Like I said, really the thing that saved it for me was Robbie Williams himself. If it weren't for his own vulnerabilities on display and that self-awareness, I would have been very frustrated by this thing. And
Yeah.
that's really the thing that saves it.
And not only is it on the nose, I think you can question if the use of it here, is it a cheap way of evoking empathy, or does it heighten Robbie's internal
That's a
conflict?
good question.
Honestly, I'm kind of torn on it. On one hand, it's so different and captivating to visually denote his psyche externally in that way, as someone who sees himself as uninvolved as you're talking about, which on its own explains why he makes the choices that he does throughout the film.
Hmm.
It is kind of poignant, but is it an emotional shortcut? Given that we're watching an animal, in this case a chimpanzee, go through these things, I think it is a shortcut because our empathy for him might be more immediate than it would be otherwise. And that is kind of a cheat. And, it's not as if Robbie is a beacon of morality here. He is
Hmm.
far from it.
Yeah.
If not for the gimmick, how much would we even care for this character? I think that's a fair question to ask because the gimmick does stifle its potency a little bit. I'm not necessarily posing that as a criticism as much as,
It's kind of a question,
again,
right?
it's this
It's
duality. It's this
yeah.
question as far as, is it cheap? It might be a little cheap, but it's also effective. Like it's kind
It's
of both at the same
it's
time.
it's cheap, but it also kind of knows it's cheap. It kind of
Yeah.
knows that it's utilizing this gimmick as sort of an exploitation of the Bambi effect, right?
Yeah,
You have a
sure.
very
Yeah.
cute thing on screen, so of course you're going to latch onto those really cute and innocent eyes, like we do with pretty much every animal in a movie.
Even
Um,
though he's snorting cocaine and having sex with groupies and
yeah,
doing all of these outlandish things, which, look, I'm not saying any of those things inherently are bad. I'm not trying to have a
mhm,
debate about morality. However, the film does pose through its actions and also through the voiceover narration that these things that he got caught up in eventually derailed his career. So it does
mhm,
offer it up as a thing that did sidetrack him.
yeah,
So if you're going to utilize those things as an argument to say they were probably bad for me, but this you're using this gimmick as a cheap way to evoke empathy when the character doesn't really earn it, and in most cases we probably wouldn't empathize with him.
mhm.
Again, I think that's where it becomes a bit of a cheat code in a way that's not necessarily earned, but it's still fascinating to see, if
I
that makes
will.
sense.
It does make sense, and I will say, as much as we say, and many have said, that you kind of forget about this gimmick maybe 10 or 15 minutes in, when you get to some of those more arduous sequences of Robbie snorting cocaine or having sex abrasively. It's in those
Mhm.
moments where I then remembered, oh yeah, he's a chimpanzee, and I think that does
Yeah.
kind of add to the charm in a way. I think that's and again, I keep going back to Robbie Williams' voiceover narration that ultimately saves the movie for me. I think that's all those things together really made this into what
Mhm.
I felt like was a pretty electrifying depiction of self-destructive stardom. And like the idea that this man is very aware and regretful of his actions, but also kind of isn't in a way. Like he almost seems to be proud of it. The way he's promoting the movie in interviews almost seems to be, I don't want to say celebratory, but that's where I draw comparisons to something like Jordan Belfort himself in The Wolf of Wall
Mhm.
Street. There is kind of this knowingness that I do think is fascinating. And like I said, when it does transition to some of those more, let's say the more R-rated sequences, seeing it handled by a chimpanzee just makes this gimmick more, again, I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's interesting. It's an interesting
Yeah.
thing and how it's handling that.
Yeah, I think another difference between you and I is that the gimmick never really fades for me. And I think the
Okay.
reason why it doesn't, and in a weird way, this is acting as a positive for me.
Hmm.
It, like I said, it completely saves this film. And without the gimmick, I would find this film extremely
Well,
bland and prosaic.
yeah, and that's
So
why you keep seeing the gimmick because yeah.
every time I noticed it, it reminded me of why I am compelled when otherwise, as I noted earlier, I might have fallen asleep at certain points in this film. But every time I would find myself snoozing off, they would do something that again would remind me that I'm not watching Robbie Williams. I'm watching a chimpanzee do all of these
Yeah.
weird things. And
Or you get a
couple that
musical
with-
number that just like just like
and I'm
pulls
not
the
even
rug. Yeah.
talking about that. That's a different thing altogether. You are correct though. I do agree with that.
Mhm.
I'm talking about in the scenes that get us between A and Z, where I find this film extremely bland. The gimmick is the only thing that keeps me from being wholly disengaged with the film.
Sure.
Because again, as mundane and trite and stereotypical as it is, you start to fade away and then you look back and you realize that's not a person that I'm looking at. It's a freaking ape. And so the gimmick does, for me anyway, save this film. And you couple that with Juno Davies, who I do think gives a really good performance here as Robbie Williams.
Sure.
That's another element of the film that I really did like, that I very much did appreciate here.
That would have been so funny if they got Andy Serkis.
Would have been hilarious. Yeah. I mean, I think he would have crushed it. We
sure, yeah.
had to find someone else to do the singing, but I think he would have done great as far as the ape is concerned. I don't know. Maybe he was on set teaching Davies how to do all of the walking maneuvering. I don't know.
Or what's his name? Terry Notary could have been there too.
Terry Notary, yeah, exactly. Although the way that the chimpanzee is utilized here, he's not pretending to be a chimpanzee, which is what they had to do in those. Like he's pretending to be a human being.
Yeah,
he just has the physical appearance of a chimpanzee.
Yeah, exactly.
At any rate, all of that to say, I was more than happy to be reminded of the gimmick. Otherwise, I would have been completely disengaged from the storytelling, which I don't think is great. I fall under the same spell as I did with The Greatest Showman here. I just don't think that he's the greatest storyteller. That Michael Gracey is the greatest storyteller. He can absolutely electrify in the musicality. To your point, when we do get to those musical sequences, some of the best stuff of the year, truly phenomenal. I don't have any disagreement with what you or anyone has said about those scenes. They are wonderful. I was completely mesmerized as much as everyone else was. Like, and I would even go beyond, even beyond the choreography and the music of it all, the way the camera is utilized. Again, I think the editing is quite clever and intuitive at times here. And it really does act wonderful as a musical. Loved it. Is it the best musical of the year? Absolutely, because I do think the way the scenes are rendered here, especially from a cinematography craft perspective, way better than anything in Wicked in that regard. A Complete Unknown, we talked about how mundane a lot of that is as well. So, yeah, I think as a musical, Better Man is quite easily the best of 2024. As a movie with consistency, that's where I don't know. I don't know.
It's a fair question.
This doesn't have the consistency as something like Wicked, or even A Complete Unknown. Like I did find it a very uneven experience.
It doesn't have the performative nucleus of Wicked, especially given Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo in that film.
For sure.
They really hold that together in a way that is very different than something like Better Man here. Better Man doesn't quite have that. Again, the thing that brings it together for me is really that voiceover narration, but I don't have to keep talking about that. I will say another thing that I love about the movie Better Man, outside of everything that we did just talk about, is I do think it does have some pretty interesting thematic ideas on its mind, especially when it gets to its conclusion. And I know that the final performance utilizing Frank Sinatra's My Way is a bit of a, I understand it's a bit of a fabrication of what happened in real life in some ways, even though that concert did actually happen. But it does get into a pretty interesting idea of someone's desperate attempts to basically receive the validation of a parent, even when that parental figure is, for lack of a better term, a shit person, but you still feel like you need that validation. In this case, Robbie's father. I actually think that's a pretty compelling idea because Robbie's father here is not a very good person. He's a very selfish person that very much feels that fame and fortune and glory is the thing you need in life. Otherwise, you're nobody. And he doesn't really evolve much past that. There's a sweet tenderness that forms between the two of them by the end, but there's no real redemption arc or anything like that. And yet this interesting idea that someone still feels like they need to receive the acceptance of that parental figure, I think is really interesting. And I think where the film concludes, psychologically speaking, is pretty compelling. And I don't know if that was on purpose or if that just happens to be some type of lucky accident given where the film is going. But I do think that's a pretty compelling idea.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think this is
Oh, wow,
where we
okay.
can come together.
We're finally friends again? Are we both the better man all of a sudden?
And I think what's interesting about that is that the validation goes both ways. I think that's why that ending sequence, as fabricated as it may or may not be, again, I don't know. I'm not watching this for a documentary. I don't care what's
and I don't care
fabricated
either.
and what isn't. But as far as storytelling goes, this is one of the few things I do think the film gets right because, as you noted, his father is a bit of a prick, an a-hole. He's very selfish. And as a result of those choices, it leads Robbie down a path who ends up choosing a lot of the same things.
Yeah.
The biggest difference is that fame and notoriety and success is not something that validates Robbie. He very much struggles with those things.
Yeah.
As you noted, his father is seeking those things, but isn't able to reach the plateau that Robbie does. And I think what's interesting is that the success of Robbie, it validates everything that his father was seeking. Even if it's not for him, it validates those things in him when he sees his son reach that plateau, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so that blinds him, though, from the reality of the struggles that Robbie is experiencing. So his response, because he's selfish, right, is, well, just pick yourself up. You're fine. You're fine.
You have all this stuff that's been given to you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it creates this conflict that I do think is really great. I wish the film spent more time on that. I wish it wasn't so much a Wikipedia and getting more into the nuances of that. Like, because I think that is great. I think the film had opportunity to really dig into that a little bit more instead of, again, doing the music biopic Wikipedia stereotype thing. But when the film is emphasizing those things, I do think it's really great. That moment there in the like makeshift pond at his home when he's laying out there and his father like that's one of the best scenes of the film.
Yeah,
It's
I
really
agree.
good.
That definitely, that thematic idea and that emotional core there definitely feels like the closest thing to this film having some type of nucleus outside of just the musicalities, right? That definitely feels like the thing tying everything together. And of course, it probably would have been a better movie had it focused on just that dynamic in a way and made that more of a centerpiece than it is sort of a surrounding piece, if that makes sense. I still think the film does a better, pun intended, job of navigating the Wikipedia style formula than some of its other contemporaries, though. I think I think if any,
we'll disagree, but
sure, yeah, but I don't disagree that it is very much on the page no different than something like a Bohemian Rhapsody. I don't think it's that much far off. I think it's a lot better.
It does the exact same things, and it is very generic what Robbie goes through. The beginning of the film, making it through the band, the struggles of the band, the fallout,
Yeah.
then the redemption arc.
Although,
like it hits every familiar conventional beat.
although it at least is willing to showcase the debauchery, which Bohemian Rhapsody seemed to be afraid of. And
I mean, I guess that's fair. Generally speaking, that's still quite trite at this point.
I don't disagree. That's more of that's a Bohemian Rhapsody comparison, not a music biopic comparison in general.
But you are right. At least it has the conviction, and you have to give Robbie Williams credit for approving this, right? Because Queen did not.
Right.
So the fact that Robbie Williams was willing to let his demons be out there, and I don't know, maybe even that is downplayed a little bit. I don't know, but it's still there. It's way more there than it was.
It's still there. And I will say, most music biopics also feature at least 2 or 3 scenes of its central figure figuring out how to write something that is very much associated with them. Right.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really get much of that here in Better Man.
There's a little bit at the end.
A little bit at the end. Yeah, but for the most part,
you're right though. Yeah.
Yeah, because again, making the comparison to Bohemian Rhapsody, we see how Bohemian Rhapsody itself is written. We see how We Will Rock You was written. We see how Another One Bites the Dust.
I'm glad it avoided that.
I'm glad it very much avoids that, and because that's something I'm very sick of seeing in these music biopics as well. If you're going to portray something like that, I'd rather just see it in a documentary and you interview the actual bandmates themselves. So I at least appreciate that this one avoids that.
And I do agree with that. And I think to your point earlier about the father character, aside from my biases as it relates to father-son relationships, but I think even when you remove that bias, it really is one of the few elements of this film that has true complexity to it, that somewhat removes the trite nature of the film, because you're really getting into the nuances of what drives these characters. And I think that idea of validation and what these characters are seeking, I think there's some great irony there, right?
Yeah.
Because Robbie wanted the success, to your point, not because that's what he wanted. He really was trying to impress his father. And then when that time comes, there's some great conflict and irony that is born out of it. And I think that's what makes the redemption moment at the end truly poignant. Like I think that element of the film is really well earned, because we do get enough of that conflict and irony throughout the film to make sense of how that validation goes both ways for the both of them. And there's a recognition when he brings him up on stage as to how false that validation kind of was, at least for his father. And it becomes this moment of purity between the two of them on the stage that I think is really great.
It's a moment of understanding that certainly does work. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Again, I wish there was more of it. I think there was more to mine out of that here, but
I don't disagree with that.
What is there, I do think is really good though.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
I did like that.
Yeah, I'd say of the music biopics that are very much following that formula, I do think Better Man is one of the better ones. I don't think it's one of the better music biopics we've had as of late. It's certainly no Blaze, right? It's no Love and Mercy.
Yeah, I agree.
I even from 2024 specifically, while I think I enjoyed watching Better Man more, I think Kneecap's a more interesting and maybe better movie.
I agree with that.
So like I think there are other music biopics that are certainly playing with the formula in a more interesting way. But if there's a movie like this that has to follow the formula, I think this one does it very well.
Yeah, for sure. And when we're simply talking musicals and removing the biopic of it all, because I do agree with, I think Kneecap, and that's another one that maybe gets forgotten a little bit because it's this little Irish film that didn't get the fanfare of even a Better Man, at least in our world. Clearly the marketing for Better Man did not really translate to a wider audience, but even in the cinephiles circle, the critics circle, Wicked is obviously going to be up there. A Complete Unknown, of course. Better Man is in that conversation. Kneecap, it's sort of been kind of trickling into some of the best international, groups. I think it, was nominated even at My mind went blank. The one over in UK.
Oh, BAFTA.
The BAFTAs. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
So like it gets nominated over there. I don't think it'll make it into the Oscar 5, but
I don't
maybe it
think
will.
so.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's my point is to say it's been a little bit more under the radar, but it's probably the best of that group. And then, and this is really under the radar. I do not expect anyone to agree with, or I don't even know how many people have even seen it. But I think I would prefer Joshua Oppenheimer's at the end over some of these as well. It is very strange and peculiar, admittedly.
Admittedly, I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, it's one of those movies that we haven't really discussed here on the show. I did see it for homework in preparation for our award show. And I think what's maybe a little disheartening is that that's a film that was on my most anticipated list for like 2 or 3 years. It's one of those movies. We joked about it on the main show this last week as far as movies that are on these lists for like several years in a row.
And then it finally comes out and it just gets kind of buried and forgotten.
It gets very much buried. And look, after seeing the film, I can kind of understand why. Okay. It is strange and peculiar. It's not going to resonate with everybody. I don't think it's a perfect film by any stretch of the imagination. It admittedly did lose me in parts in the middle. But in terms of consistency, committing to its convictions, which it very much does, faults and all, I think I prefer the ambition of that to something like, even Wicked and especially A Complete Unknown.
Well, it's easy to respect a movie like that for going for those things.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I kind of feel the same about Better Man and The End in terms of like my overall ranking. I'd probably rate them about the same. I think they both have things going for them, but also things working against them simultaneously.
Sure.
Which is why in the end, Kneecap might be the best of the ball. Unfortunately, it's going to get the least fanfare of the ball outside of The End, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. It was a strange year for the musical in 2024.
It was. I'm curious to see what else Hollywood has up its sleeve, if anything. I mean, we know we're getting Wicked for Good in 2025. I don't know if we're getting any other musicals this year. I know we just got done talking about our most anticipated of 2025. We didn't really talk about many musicals. So there might be some that we're just unaware of, and I'm curious to see if there is anything that's going to, challenge the form in a way. So we'll see. I'd like to see something come out that does that.
Yeah, I'm not really too sure because the only films I can think of off the cuff here without doing any sort of research is, of course, Wicked for Good and Snow White.
That doesn't count.
I can think of.
That doesn't count.
I mean, I have zero.
That already came out. That movie already came out over 100 years ago, or almost 100 years ago, I should say.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not really looking forward to the live action remake at all.
No, there's a reason we didn't mention that on our most anticipated episode of 2025.
Exactly. But you are right. I'm sure there's gonna be something that comes along that we're not really familiar with, or that we didn't really talk about. But musicals in 2024. Maybe it wasn't the greatest year for musicals. On the whole, we didn't even mention Moana 2, which was just really bad, just flat.
Again, doesn't count.
Yeah. So, but look, I'm willing to hear the argument for Better Man, because again, it's doing something very unique, very different, and even when I did find myself in those mundane areas, I was still weirdly compelled by that's not Robbie Williams on screen, and I'm still engaged even though I'm not. Like I'm at least looking at the screen even though I find this boring.
As Robbie Williams himself says, JD, let me entertain you, and he does.
Yeah. When they get to the musical sequences, it is very, very entertaining. There's no denying that for sure.
So come on, let me.
So yeah, I mean,
you.
Kneecap was probably the best. I would argue that's the best musical of the year, but Better Man. The most entertaining and unique and different. And all my criticisms aside, I will always credit the film for its for its gimmick. Because I do think it's interesting, it's new, it's different, it's taking a swing, even if it doesn't always work for me. I appreciate that it's attempting to do like, and again, that's the irony of it for me. It's attempting to do something different, and when it's really committing to that, it is different. But everything in between is so conventional and trite that it just weirdly collapses on itself. Like it's weird in that way.
I also think it's interesting the choice of using a chimpanzee. I think I heard an interview with Robbie Williams. He was talking about a conversation he had with the film's director. I guess this was partially the director's Michael Gracey's idea. And he asked Robbie, what do you see yourself as? Like, what animal do you see yourself as? And I think Robbie said a lion. And Michael's response was, no. I guess said, no, not that.
No.
We're not doing that.
No,
and then landed on this. Yeah.
Chimpanzee we can do. We can make there's a VFX studio just down the street. They've done that for a decade now. We can handle that.
I'm sure I wonder if we'll see this gimmick again. I know some people were joking about that on Twitter, that we might see this gimmick again for other artists, for other musicians.
If we do, it's going to be for someone extremely famous in the United States exclusively.
I saw someone on Twitter post that they want to see one of Lou Bega, the singer of Mambo No. 5, but they want him portrayed as an iguana.
That's definitely not going to happen. It's going to take a giant superstar. Maybe Snoop Dogg. Maybe you can convince Snoop Dogg to become a dog on camera.
I was gonna say, you know, it would be really funny if Snoop Dogg does it, but he's a cat.
Or that. Maybe you have some irony there.
Yeah,
because that's the only way it's going to happen. When you have a movie like this that cost $110 million and you gross 14, I don't know if we are going to see anything like this again.
And the money is on screen. You could really see the money on screen with this movie. It looks expensive.
Weta did their job. They did their job very, very well, and I do commend them for that. The money is on the screen. I agree.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if we'll see anything like this again. At least not anytime soon. And if we do, I think it's going to be again. But even then, I mean, if Robbie Williams is that big of a superstar overseas, and by all accounts he is, and it still failed this miserably. What did I say? The UK, 6.5 million. I don't even know if Hollywood would be willing to take a risk on that on an American superstar.
I mean, there's another huge missed opportunity from a marketing standpoint that could have really helped push this movie. You have Liam and Noel Gallagher from Oasis as characters here for a brief moment. And Oasis is a band that just got back together and are on tour and are making headlines. That's a selling point right there. There's a connective tissue there, and they're not choosing to acknowledge that. So there's, again, missed opportunities, but this really should be more of a hit.
Yeah. It is unfortunate. Look, a lot of people have really liked this way more than I have, and I'm glad. I'm glad people are able to enjoy this despite how I feel derivative it might be narratively. A lot of people are walking out really loving the film, and I do think if more people went to see it, if the general audiences did go see it, I think they would enjoy it more so than I did.
I think it's accessible. Yeah, I think it's a movie I can recommend to a lot of people, honestly.
I agree. Like because The Greatest Showman, I think, did very well at the box office.
It did. That was kind of a smash. Yeah.
Yeah. Like if those same people went to see Better Man, I think they would enjoy this. I think they would. Like it's a lot of the same formula. So, the marketing maybe just wasn't there. I don't know. Maybe it'll turn around once it comes home on demand.
This is one that I think the people may find later. It definitely seems. I think
so too. Yeah. I mean, it comes out at a weird time, right? Like we're off the heels of Christmas. Christmas had so much to offer at the theaters, and the new year turns around and everyone's busy with the holidays and stuff. I do wonder if the timing of the release just maybe wasn't ideal.
This really should have been more of a Thanksgiving movie, I think.
Perhaps. Yeah. I think you're right on that.
Yeah, you're right. The release was kind of weird. It was
I think they
wonky.
jumbled the release a little bit as well. And the marketing.
Yeah, I agree with that.
If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, and I'm assuming a lot of people have disagreed with me. That's perfectly fine. Leave us a comment.
Still like the
below.
movie overall, though. So
I did. Look, I gave this a 3.5 on Letterboxd.
that's a very good score. That's
context.
a very
Yeah.
good score.
Yeah. So, like, I overall very much did enjoy it. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but I liked the music of the film. Did I say that?
I think you did, but you can say it again. I think people would like to hear it. And it's interesting,
Yeah.
even though we find ourselves on slightly different ends of the spectrum here, I was kind of toying with giving this a 3.5 or even a 4 on Letterboxd. I gave it a 4, but if anything, this is kind of one of those where I wish there was a middle ground even more, like a 3.75 out of 5. That's really where I'm feeling on this one.
Sure,
So we're
fair, yeah.
not too far off in that regard.
Yeah. Despite all of our disparities, we're close there. Yeah.
Yeah.
At any rate, if you agree or disagree, leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. All right. As I noted a moment ago, or some time ago, I guess, on the main show this week, we talked about our most anticipated films of the year. We did a little segment on the late, great David Lynch, if you want to go and check that out as well.
Yeah.
We talked about The Brutalist and AI, which Brady Corbet, as we are recording this, and we're recording this the day after we did that episode, he's clarified.
He's already
So
made a statement
there's
about it.
Even more clarity to what we talked about on that show. And we speculated that the amount of it might not have been that much. I stated specifically, what if it was just 5%? That's all it was. And I
think
was
it was
pretty
less
close.
than that. I think it was less than that,
It was less
actually.
than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was a 2-minute scene for the whole Adrian Brody thing when he's speaking actual Hungarian. That's the only time they utilized it there. And he clarified the design element of as well, which was overblown in terms of the discourse. Anyway, so
You said 2-minute scene?
I think so, right? Is that what it?
Okay, so 2-minute scene in conjunction with the film's 215-minute runtime, that's less than 1%.
So yeah, my 5% was way overstated.
In actuality, it's 0.93%.
There you go. So yeah, I mean, I was pretty correct that the bulk of the film, the ethos of how they've talked about it, is still very much intact. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily condone the use of AI,
Right.
but when it's minimal in this way, and it's really, the way they've described it is it's really just a tool that helps the artist create their art, much like Photoshop is. It's just like a more enhanced version of a Photoshop.
It didn't take away an artist's job.
No, it did not take away their job. It just helped them do their thing.
Yeah. That's a difference.
And that's it.
Big difference.
And that's what the sound designer person was saying. Like, because I read something that, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it was something along the lines of, if the sound designer was going to do it manually, it would have taken, I don't know what is 10 times longer than it would have without that tool. I don't know how true that is when we're talking about a scene that's just a few minutes long. But I think the point is that, we have these tools that help me do my job better. Yeah. I'm going to use them, but I'm still the one doing the work.
Absolutely.
Is ultimately what,
and that's a huge
big difference.
It's not like AI rendered extras that could have been paid to someone else that was still a part of SAG,
it's
right?
It's not that at all.
Yeah.
Not that at all. But what did I say about sports and hit pieces in Ohio State?
I think we're done here.
I'm just saying. All right. Anyway, we talked a lot about that. We will have another review coming out this week as well. We're going to talk about Den of Thieves 2. Very excited to get into that as well. There's also a Chasing the Gold. Shadon and Cameron did their Oscars predictions for the nominations that are coming out tomorrow as this episode is released. Or Thursday, because I think this is coming out on a Tuesday.
Yes.
So this Thursday is the nominations, but that predictions episode is already available. It's live right now. You can go and check that out. And they will have another episode on Friday reacting to said nominations. So All right. With all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Robbie Williams.
Let me entertain you.